Welcome to week 6 of English 320 American Literature after 1865. This week we are focusing on mid century voices and the pressures that shaped them, including war, anxiety, social change, and shifting ideas about the American dream. This week, I want you to leave with a clear set of skills you can use in discussion and in your writing. Pause here and read this week's learning objectives. After World War II, much of American writing began circling the same pressure point. People are trying to rebuild and return to normal, but many texts show a profound disillusionment with what traditional values were supposed to guarantee. You will see skepticism where you might expect confidence, and you will see characters who are doing everything right but still feel unsettled. This is where the era's existential questions come in: meaning, purpose, and authenticity. Pay attention to how often a text asks, directly or indirectly, what it means to live an authentic life in a world that is trying to standardize what real should look like. As you read, keep one guiding question in your mind. When does a text portray conformity as safety, and when does it describe it as constraint? What specific evidence makes you say so, such as diction, tone, imagery, setting, details, patterns in dialogue, or what happens to characters who follow the script versus those who resist it? Post war suburbia becomes one of the era's most recognizable stages for exploring conformity. The setting is rarely just background, it is a social script with rules about respectability, status, and belonging. When a text places characters in neighborhoods, homes, workplaces, and community spaces that feel orderly or standardized, it often invites us to notice how that order is maintained and what it costs. As you read, track the status markers the text emphasizes, such as job title, house, consumption, and public reputation. Then look for the tension between what characters perform in public and what they admit, suppress, or cannot say in private. Many post-war texts frame conflict as a quiet crisis rather than an obvious catastrophe: boredom that feels like suffocation, anxiety with no single cause, alienation within successful routines, or resentment that leaks out indirectly. Also keep asking who is included in the suburban ideal and who's positioned as outside it through description, omission, or judgment from neighbors, institutions, or narration. For close reading, pick one scene and name the success script the text assumes, explicitly or implicitly. Then identify a precise moment where that script cracks, such as a contradiction, irony, an awkward silence, or a detail that does not fit the polished image. Anchor your analysis in at least one formal cue, like staging, repeated motifs, repetition of phrasing, or an abrupt tonal shift. To test your interpretation, draft two defensible claims about the same evidence, one where conformity appears protective and one where it seems damaging. Then decide which claim the text supports more strongly and why. Mass culture is one way to think about how popular stories can make a social order feel normal, natural, and hard to imagine otherwise. A Frankfurt School style argument claims that entertainment can carry a quiet lesson in adjustment. Problems are shown, strong feelings are produced, but the ending often returns the audience to acceptance rather than change. One pattern to watch for is when the conflict feels predetermined, so that by the end, society still wins. The story may move tension around without seriously threatening the larger system. Another pattern is when the narrative highlights individual flaws so heavily that structural pressures fade into the background. In that case, the audience is pushed toward a moral about personal choices rather than questions about institutions, economics, or power. A third pattern is when emotional catharsis replaces critique. If the audience gets a satisfying release, a dramatic confession or a tidy resolution, or a moment of forgiveness, that feeling can function like closure even if the underlying conditions remain the same. As you read, ask what the text is training you to feel most strongly: sympathy, disgust, fear, admiration, relief, and where that emotion points your attention. Then ask who or what is blamed. Is it a single person, a family, a community, a vague sense of fate, or a visible system? Next, ask what alternatives are imaginable inside the story world. Who is allowed to propose a different way of living, and what happens to them? Finally, scrutinize the ending. If nothing changes structurally, does the text frame that stasis as critique, resignation, or confirmation? Now let's layer in the Cold War. There's fear, surveillance, uncertainty, and even when it's not directly mentioned, you can feel it in the text. Take a moment to read what to look for. Now think about the following question: how can fear of nuclear annihilation shape form? That's fragmentation, irony, understatement, even when bombs are never named. Not everyone accepted cultural norms. Some writers pushed back. That's where counterculture comes in. They reject the idea of a normal life. The Beats are all about freedom and spontaneity. They reject structure, not just in life, but in writing. Their writing feels raw, immediate, almost improvised. The confessional poetry movement turns inward, but in a very direct way. Writers are openly talking about personal experiences, mental health, relationships, and pain. What used to be private becomes public. Here are your close reading questions. How does spontaneity on the page differ from an orderly, respectable prose style? What effect does each create? As you answer this question, think about what mainstream values get rejected and what is being celebrated instead. Try looking at confessional poetry through this lens. How might a text form be a method of resisting conformity? Think about the tension this causes between private experience and public norms. This is our big text for the week: Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. It is a tragic play following 63-year-old traveling salesman Willy Loman, who struggles to accept his failure to achieve the American dream. Over 24 hours, his mental state fractures, leading to strained family confrontations, job loss, and tragedy. This play is about pressure, especially the pressure to succeed. It asks, is the problem the system or the individual? This graphic illustrates the analysis framework we will use to examine Willy Loman. The goal is to practice literary criticism as a discipline, noticing patterns, weighing evidence, and separating what the text shows from what we assume. Start with the tension between dream and reality. Willy's belief in being well liked functions like an internal script for success, and the framework highlights how that script clashes with his lived outcomes. As you read, track where the play shows Willy trying to protect the dream, where the dream collapses, and how that collapse shapes his relationships, especially with his son, Biff. Next, consider the social and economic lens alongside the personal one. The Marxist critique portion asks you to think about how labor, productivity, and money shape value in the world of the play. As you evaluate that lens, ask yourself what the play suggests about work and worth, and whether the pressure comes mainly from society, from the workplace, from family expectations, or from Willie's own internalization of those expectations. Finally, use the character comparison at the bottom as a check on your interpretation. Compare how Willie, Biff, and Charlie define success, and then identify what each definition costs them. While discussing Willie's suicide, keep the focus on textual evidence and thematic meaning rather than judgment. At its core, this is a story about the gap between dreams and reality. And the gap is shaped by money, success, and expectations. Pause here and review the discussion question. We will apply two critical lenses to this week's reading. Is Willie Loman a social tragedy, or is he a personal failure? Lens A treats the play as a social tragedy, meaning the harm is not only personal or accidental, but shaped by larger structures such as labor expectations, economic pressure, and social definitions of worth. As you discuss, keep the focus on what the play repeatedly makes visible, which pressures feel unavoidable, and how those pressures shape choices, relationships, and self understanding. For the mini debate, push beyond labeling a character as simply right or wrong. Ask how beliefs are taught and reinforced, and whether the play encourages you to widen the frame to systems or narrow it to a single person's flaws. Test your reading. Identify what would count as strong counter evidence against a system critique interpretation, such as moments where the text clearly locates the central cause in an individual's choices alone, or where institutions are portrayed as fair, flexible, or genuinely supportive in ways that reduce structural pressure. Lens B tests a skeptical idea. The play may seem to criticize the social order, but the more profound lesson might be adjustment and acceptance rather than change. In this reading, the story's emotional force can move the audience towards pity and resignation rather than towards a sustained critique of the system. As you read, look for moments where the world feels fixed, where resistance is portrayed as ineffective, and when the narrative or other characters imply that the safest path is to know the rules and adapt. Also notice whether attention repeatedly shifts from social structures to individual flaws, because that shift can make systemic pressure feel like a personal problem to manage. Use the evidence tests on the right to guide you. Up to this point, we have practiced context, close reading, and lenses as separate tools. Now the goal is to combine them into one defensible interpretation where you can explain not only what the play says, but how it produces meaning and why your reading fits the evidence. This concludes this lecture. As always, if you have questions, just reach out. You can reach out during office hours or via email or in the discussion boards. Bye bye.